Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Star Quest Production Network at sqpn.com. Now, today we're on day 224 and we're covering Apostolicum Exercitum 28-29 on lay formation for the apostolate. That's going to be the subject of chapter 6, which we're starting, which is the formation on the apostolate. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we noted that clergy and religious must respect lay apostolate. We need cooperation in lay apostolate both inside and outside the church. Today, as we start chapter 6, we're talking about the formation of lay apostles is important and should work with all aspects of the person, not just a narrow apostolate formation. So, we're going to cover paragraphs 28 and 29. 28 has one subparagraph. 29 has, I think, 7 or thereabouts. So 28 is a little shorter. So let's go with 28. The summary of 28 is apostolate will be more fruitful with formation. So let's read it. The apostolate can attain its maximum effectiveness only through a diversified and thorough formation. This is demanded not only by the continuous spiritual and doctrinal progress of the layperson himself, but also by the accommodation of the activity of circumstances varying according to the affairs, persons, and duties involved. This formation for the apostolate should rest upon these bases, which have been stated and proclaimed by this most holy council and other documents. In addition to the formation, which is common for all Christians, many forms of the apostolate demand also specific and particular formation because of the variety of persons and circumstances. 2 notes before I give a little summary. First of all, when it says the layperson himself, we could also translate this as themself or him or herself. In Latin, if you are talking about an individual person and it's an indeterminate one, whether it's male or female, you just use him, and the translator has chosen to translate that literally, as opposed to translate that as themselves or him or herself. Just so you're aware that this is referring to all lay people, not just men or males, young, I guess boys would count himself. And then here it says other documents here, right? So the footnote goes to Lumen Gentium and Unitatis Redemptionis Gratiae. So this is important in this idea of these documents also speaking about lay formation for the apostolate, because this is an important aspect. But overall, after those 2 notes, I think this paragraph is pretty straightforward. We need formation to be effective. This formation is both kind of theoretical and doctrinal and spiritual, and it's going to have specifics for this apostolate. If, for example, I want you to teach CCD and you want to teach CCD, well, I need to teach you in some basic pedagogy. And so the training specific to that apostle is probably more about pedagogy. Whereas if we're going down to serve the homeless people at the soup kitchen, the practical training is going to be a little different because it's a different type of apostolate. And I think we need to be aware of that. And we can't just leave it at that. We do need that doctrinal and spiritual one. People need to know Jesus, know what's the truth of the faith, know the creed, but also know in a personal way what you do through that spiritual formation. We can only pass on what we have received, so if people don't know Jesus, they can't pass on Jesus. And that's important because the apostolate is the passing on of Jesus, the transmission of the truth about life, about the Trinity, about Jesus, etc. So moving on to paragraph 29, as I noted, has 7 subparagraphs. I'm going to read in 3 parts. A to C is on lay formation should be adapted to the lay state in each person. D and E are about the need for intellectual and human formation. F and G is formation needs to be hands-on and can help lay people fulfill their mission. So let's start right away with 29A. Since the laity share in their own way in the mission of the Church, their apostolic formation is especially characterized by the distinctively secular and particular quality of the lay state and by its own form of the spiritual life. B. The formation for the apostolate presupposes a certain human and well-rounded formation adapt to the natural abilities and conditions of each layperson. Well informed about the modern world, the layperson should be a member of his own community and adjusted to its culture. C. However, the layperson should learn especially how to perform the mission of Christ in the Church by basing his life on belief in the divine mystery of creation and redemption, and by being sensitive to the movement of the Holy Spirit, who gives life to the people of God and who urges all to love God the Father as well as the world and men in him. This formation should be deemed the basis and condition for every successful apostolate. I think it's important here to note how this is talking about the need to have formation adapt to the laity. You all have your own mission in the church. I assume most of my audience is lay, and you're the ones who are supposed to go out to the secular fields, to the bank, to the manufacturing place, to the be a nurse on the wing of the hospital, things like that. That I, as a priest, can't be there. I don't have the specialized expertise. And your formation is not just many priest formation or many religious formation. No, there's a specific formation for bringing Christ into the secular world. Now, obviously, this also has to be adapted to times and places because different issues are going to be different concerns. Different kinds of people are going to have different things that have to be. You're going to have certain things, and how do you respond to those is part of this formation. And the second thing that's really big in these subparagraphs is this idea of apostolate formation linking to other formation. In the Legion Regnum Christi, we talk a lot about integral formation. We talk about 4 areas, which we talk about intellectual, so like studying the faith. It also, if you're talking about a school, includes math and English and things like that. The human, which is things about virtues, things about being dignified, things like that. And then spiritual, prayer, spiritual life, sacraments and things. And then apostolate, which is what we're talking about here, the formation for the apostolate. And this fourth area, this apostolate formation, can't just be on its own because without the others, it's very hard to do the apostolate. And so we want that well-rounded area. And it explicitly mentions that kind of intellectual and human areas. It says, the natural capacities, abilities, that they have a well-rounded formation, that they understand things, right? And those are those other areas of formation. So it's not just apostolate formation out on its own, but apostolate formation is linked to so much more. And then it's talking finally about the learning to be part of the church. You need to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit. You need to work harmoniously. It is not just that I do my apostolate all up there and ignore the rest of the church. No, that's not a good idea. I do my apostolate, and my apostolate works in the church. Now, obviously, my own, personally, I teach at a seminary, and that's very, very, very obviously in the heart of the church and very much in line with the church. It might be a little more challenging to see how it's connected and working with the church if you're doing some kind of apostolate where you're bringing Jesus into your own workplace or things like that. But it is important to do that in unity. So moving on to paragraphs D and E, the summary is that we need intellectual and human formation as well, and we need spiritual formation too, which is more linked with the apostolic formation because you're learning about Jesus and how to spread Jesus. But D and E are more about the human and intellectual formation. So let's read them. 29D. In addition to spiritual formation, a solid doctrinal instruction in theology, ethics, and philosophy, adjusted to the differences of age, status, and natural talents is required. The importance of general culture, along with the practical and technical formation, should also be kept in mind. E. To cultivate good human relations, truly human values must be fostered, especially the art of living fraternally and cooperating with others and of striking friendly conversation with them. So we need apostles to have correct doctrine. If they're passing on, we want them to pass on correct doctrine. Now, that's important. We need people to have an understanding. Too often I've met adult Catholics who have what I would call a second or third grade understanding of the faith. Now, it's great that my nephews who are that age have that understanding of the faith. It's totally appropriate. It's perfectly fine. But if you're 50 years old and have a master's degree in some kind of field, and that's your understanding of the faith, that's a big problem. Our understanding of faith needs to advance with our age, so we understand things like theology, ethics, philosophy. Now, obviously, I'm not going to teach Thomistic metaphysics to my nephews in second grade. That would be a little much. I can't give an adult formation talk at a parish on Thomistic metaphysics, and I think it's important to understand as a philosophical principle, but you have to adapt to age, and I'm not going to teach that to second graders. It's a little too much. And I think circumstances are important, and I think, for example, we need to understand what kind of issues are in the area. For example, in other parts of the world, the Mormon Trinitarian heresy is not necessary. But in Canada, the U.S., Mormons are a significant portion of non-Trinitarian or non-standard Trinitarian Christians. They would call themselves Trinitarian, but they don't have the standard view of three persons and one God that Catholics, Orthodox, and a large portion of Protestants have. And so if I'm teaching about the Trinity, I'm going to mention the errors of Mormonism. Not that the errors of Mormonism are the greatest errors in the history of the church, have the biggest portion of Christians, but in this country, it is one of the bigger errors. And so it's worth teaching as an example there. Obviously other things. If you live in another country, there's a lot of Buddhists, you need to talk about how the relationship between Buddhism and Christianity and what is good and bad in Buddhism so that if you're talking to Buddhists, you can hopefully bring them to know, love, and serve Jesus. Whereas in the U.S., there are very few Buddhists. And the ones who are Buddhists are much more kind of New Age, modern American Buddhists, not traditional Buddhists, most often. There are some traditional Buddhists as well. So the other thing is that to understand human virtues are good, so that we have honesty, we have fortitude, we have temperance, right use of sense faculties. Those things are good. And it's not just, spiritual and ignore all human. No, I think there's a certain tendency among certain Catholics to be like, just focus on the spiritual, ignore the human. No, but the human is good, and the Vatican is telling us this. The fathers of Vatican II are telling us this, all these bishops. So moving on to the last two subparagraphs, F and G, formation needs to be hands-on and can help lay people fulfill their mission. Let's go. 29F. Since formation for the apostolate cannot consist in merely theoretical instruction, from the beginning of their formation, ladies should gradually and prudently learn how to view, judge, and do all things in light of faith, as well as develop and improve themselves along with others through doing, thereby entering into active service to the church. This formation, always in need of improvement because the increasing maturity of the human person and the proliferation of problems, requires an ever-deeper knowledge and planned activity. In the fulfillment of all demands of formation, the unity and integrity of the human person must be kept in mind and at all times so that this harmony and balance may be safeguarded and enhanced. G. In this way, the layperson engages himself wholly and actively in the reality of the temple order and effectively assumes his role in conducting the affairs of this order. At the same time, as a living member or witness of the church, he renders the church present and active in the midst of temporal affairs. This first subparagraph F really talks about how we need to be hands-on. We need to bring it into how we judge things in light of faith. So it's like, hey, we bring in a news story. How do we judge this in light of faith? I can bring in a news story that's very straightforward, say some law on abortion. And I can teach my nephews who are in elementary school, hey, the church teaches abortion. We don't kill unborn babies, things like that, and help them judge that in light of faith. If I'm teaching seminarians, they hopefully already know that, but I might bring in a little more complicated bioethics problem to bioethics class. Well, I definitely will if I'm teaching bioethics class. And ask them to analyze it because they're much more advanced. They should know more. And if I'm doing with doctors, I would do similarly because even though they are not necessarily going to have as much other formation, doctors should have a very strong formation in bioethics so they know what's ethical and what's not. And then it's hands-on at doing apostolate. We accompany them. We help them to learn to do the apostolate. I don't just say, hey, here's an apostolate, do it. No, I say, hey, this is an apostolate I was doing. Let's do it together for 2 months, and then I'm going to move on. You're going to take over or something like that. And that hands-on really helps grow, and it moves on to greater responsibility. I'm not going to put somebody who's not familiar with Catholic education to be the principal. It's much better I have a teacher who's been a teacher in a Catholic school for 10, 12 years and has maybe some extra masters in education or something that's usually for a principal, to be a principal because she understands how Catholic school works and hopefully she's done a good job of doing it as a teacher. Otherwise, might not promote her to being a principal, right? So we want to move in that way. And this subparagraph G is just saying, hey, all of what we talked about today really helps you lay people transform the temple order, and that's important. So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and I do this podcast on a volunteer basis. And my local religious community relies on donations to help pay our bills. If you want to support my community, you go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. There's also a link for a one-time donation and for Patreon on my own site, frmatthewlc. If you want to donate to StarQuest, sqpn.com/give will allow you to do that. Tomorrow we're going to continue on the next paragraphs in Apostolicum Exercitatem, which is paragraph 30 on beginning apostolic formation in schools, so really applying what we talked about today into Catholic schools. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook or X. Amen.